I think that everybody who has a long-running show and tentacles that reach into personal life always says it was like a family. And indeed, in this instance, it also was, but ours was particularly dramatic. I only realized recently that The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. in 1966 was actually a groundbreaking television event, insofar as it was, in fact, the first hour-long television series starring a woman. Little did I know I was going to make television history. You know, it was not a time where one actually thought of themselves in those terms. That we were all working actors. I had been under contract to Columbia Pictures. I was not, at the time, allowed to do television. There was very much of a distinction between film actors and television actors, and the studio system was the tail end of the studio system. And I had been under contract to them for about 5 years, during which they had employed me for 3 motion pictures a year. No television whatsoever was allowed. So when The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. came about, MGM actually bought me out of my contract with Columbia in order to do it. So it was quite stressful. I wasn't sure that this was the right thing to do. I wasn't sure whether, you know, this was a career ender or a career beginner. And as it turned out, it was a very fortunate decision, because television series began to come into their own in such a way that the format, which had been very well established by Warner Brothers quite a few years earlier, really became everything that we know today. Well, it was also a time when you know, the British pop scene had just happened. You know, Carnaby Street was happening, and I was spending a lot of time in England. I worked there continually, and at the time I was dating someone who then became my first husband, who was in the process of making 2001: A Space Odyssey for Stanley Kubrick. So I was sort of living in London with him, and, you know, very well accustomed to the lifestyle in London on Carnaby Street, shops, and the King's Road and all, which I had frequented. So I was already this sort of mid-Atlantic character, and when all of that started to sort of find its way slowly to the United States, The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. was about to happen. And we thought that it would be very nice if my companion represented the sort of English mod. They were mods and rockers. That was the kind of period it was. Represented that sort of mid-Atlantic sort of mod thing. And so I brought a lot of clothes back from Carnaby Street. So I wore a lot of those clothes on the show. My little boots and my little caps and all these sort of things, which was very much not on television at the time. And of course we had a writer-producer who loved spoofing all of the spy shows, and he would put us in the most fantastic conditions. I remember Stan Freberg. We had fabulous guest stars. Stan Freberg and I were popped out of a giant toaster at a certain point. I have a photograph of it, and it's the silliest thing anyone could actually do. And on one occasion, we had Boris Karloff in drag. It was called the Mother Muffin Affair. And there was Boris Karloff in drag. I was so excited to have Boris Karloff in the show. I had showed up for makeup, and there were lots of people in the makeup room, and I jumped into my seat and I said, oh, I'm, you know, having such a good time waiting to see Boris Karloff and all this. little did I realize that he was sitting in the chair next to me, and he suddenly turned around as an old woman with gray hair and in a dress and bust and everything, turned around and said, "Yes, my dear, how do you do?" You know, he played it completely for effect. And but we had fabulous guest stars. We had Peggy Lee, Ruth Roman. We had wonderful people on our show. And Southern, great stars of the day. And of course, Peggy Lee, how fabulous. And so it was a great privilege to know her. And many of them became friends. Well, because our writer-producer had such a propensity for this high camp kind of satire, it was very different than The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And of course, Noel Harrison and I took to it like ducks to water. And NBC kept sending notes down to us to say, they ought to take this more seriously, because The Man from U.N.C.L.E. is taking everything very seriously. And I sent them a photograph of me hanging upside down in a harem costume with my hands tied behind my back while they dripped oil on my feet to torture me, saying, "Speak, speak." You know, I mean, that's it. We're supposed to take that really seriously. We need more camp. We don't have that kind of camp on TV anymore.
So it was fun to do.
Oh, it was just delicious, adorable. We had so much fun and outrageous. And when I look at them, they all look like cartoons today, but they were kind of fun.
Do they hold up in your mind?
Well, not exactly. I think the techniques of filming were so different, and I think I'd have to go back and look at enough of them, because there are good ones and bad ones. And don't forget, in those days, we did an hour show in 6 days, and not 7 days, as we did, as I did with 2 other television series, and we did 26 episodes a year, and we made air dates, which is almost unheard of today. It's extraordinary when you think how much was produced, really good television was produced, and dramatic television was produced so quickly, well shot, and with 26 episodes a year. It's quite remarkable when you consider that most shows today don't come near that. I think today's the television of those days, of the 60s and 70s, was more difficult. The most difficult role in those television series was the role of the writer. Those poor things were like battered children. You know, they were the battered children of the industry. They would write away, you know, and then everybody would tear up what they did and go back and write some more. And oh, the poor things. It's terribly difficult to produce that amount of television, of our television a year, if you're a writer. I mean, they were shell-shock victims after the first year. Well, I always remembered seeing Doris Day play Calamity Jane. So my image of Calamity Jane was Doris Day riding the stagecoach and singing songs and everything. They had something else in mind, so it was a little bit different. But Bonanza was such a great show. It was, I loved Westerns, I loved horseback riding, I still do, and all of the incumbent kind of atmosphere of that show. And everybody on it was adorable. They couldn't have been nicer. All the boys were great. And
well, what's it like being the only girl on an all-boys show?
Fabulous. I love being the only girl. I play a game called polo, and people say, my gosh, isn't that dangerous? Why do you do that? And I've always said, well, my God, have you ever looked at an Argentine polo player? 7 gorgeous men chasing me on a field of play with horses and green grass. What's not to like? That's sort of like Bonanza, the only girl in a male cast. I think Westerns in the 50s, 60s, and maybe even creeping into the 70s still lingered on the origins of our appreciation of the Old West through the early movies of the 30s, 40s. The beginning of motion pictures always encompassed not only the Keystone Cops, but men on horseback with black hats and white hats. You could see that in black and white. You know, the bad guys with the black hat and the good guys with the white hat was pretty obvious in black and white, and it became simply a part of the firmament, and it was definitely a type of film, which of course was brought to its greatest glory during the John Ford period. And when you look at those films today and you see such magnificent photography, I mean, they look like each setup of some of John Ford's earlier films is a still picture of its own. It's magnificent art. So I believe that it was ripe in our memories. I think we've been weaned away from that due to the replacement of action-adventure heroes being very different from our cowboys of the Old West. And I think there's still something that kind of twangs, if you like, in our emotional psyche, because it's the image of the Old West, the building of the United States, and I still think a good Western has a future, I hope. It's very near and dear to my heart, and I think and hope it is to others. I don't think anybody who ever worked with Jimmy Garner on the Rockford Files or anywhere else could possibly have walked away without saying that he was one of the greatest actors to work opposite in their careers. He was the quintessential tennis player who would throw the ball right back to you. And charm, adorable. I think every woman who ever worked with him always felt that they had a special, I know I felt, oh no, we had something special, you know, together. And I think everybody who ever, man or woman, cherishes having worked with him. There are many schools of acting, and there is a certain school that sort of believes that actors should create some kind of a rapport between each other in order to have certain chemistry, so that you're not working in isolation. It's more rewarding. Of course, it's the school that I come from, so I see it as being something which is much more rewarding, and it's sometimes called give and take. It's sometimes an exchange. I call it a tennis match, because a great tennis player raises the level of your game, and a good sort of sparring partner, sort of tennis player, when you're practicing, hits the ball right back to you. So it's not about giving you the killer shot so that you are left on your own and lose the point. A good tennis match between two actors is having someone hit the ball back to you. Then you can hit it back to them, and they hit it back to you, and it goes on like that. The finesse and the play, and it creates I think the end result is a great exchange, and I think it's extremely rewarding. Aaron and Leonard Goldberg, Aaron Spelling and Leonard Goldberg, got together let me go back. Aaron Spelling began as a writer, as I'm sure you know. And I first met Aaron Spelling when he coached our girls' softball team. He was married at the time to Carolyn Jones, and he was writing for Dick Powell's show, I think. There was Dick Powell had his own production company, and I believe that Aaron was a staff writer there, and also then began to not develop his own work, but they began to develop some of his own work. When he got together with Leonard Goldberg, they really began to have this create the extraordinary history, television history that they did. And the first actual television movie that they did, which I believe was the first, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was their first enterprise together, was called Five Desperate Women. Not Desperate Housewives, Desperate Women, and I was one of the desperates. And we filmed on Catalina Island, and Joan Hackett and Jeanette Comer and two others. And it was a murder mystery, and it was a little bit like Five Little Indians, where everybody was going to get knocked off. He then later went on to do some of the television series that we remember him for, but in the Quinn Martin days, Aaron was not yet producing those sort of, and Quinn Martin had a real formula, definite formula, and yes, the difference in the production companies was palpable. Of course, don't forget that Quinn Martin was independent, so that too made him a kind of freer spirit. He dealt directly with his productions and the network. He didn't go through a studio, so that was a very different kind of a feeling. Also, the budgets were very different, and you really felt the strain in wardrobe and in certain sets, which were used penuriously, shall we say. They were used with great economy, overused and used. I'm sure if you look at any of Quinn Martin's shows, you'll see the same set over and over and over again. And sometimes you'll see the same stories rehashed over and over and over again, because he recycled an awful lot of his products on the various shows that he did. So you'd see the same story on several different shows. And of course, there were lots of, I think at one point I held the record for, unfortunately, pilots that were never came to fruition. But one of my favorites was Ellery Queen, in which I co-starred with Peter Lawford, and he was going to play the Ellery Queen crime writer, and I thought it was a delightful pilot, and I had great hopes for it, and unfortunately it didn't sell. But eventually one pilot did sell, and it was called The Feather and Father Gang, and Harold Gould played my father, and I was an attorney, and Harold Gould was a former con man, and he had a collection of sort of Damon Runyon-esque characters as friends who all worked behind the scenes to help me resolve my crimes, much to my horror in some cases. And I thought that was delightful, but I guess either the public or the network didn't, so we didn't come back after 1 year. And then I didn't think that I was going to do another series, and I was in the midst of doing a theatrical production. I was doing Cyrano de Bergerac with Stacy Keach. We were on our way to Broadway. So there was a phone call from Aaron Spelling, Tom Mankiewicz, and Robert Wagner. And they had a pilot for, another pilot for a television series called Hart to Hart. And I said, oh God, and we all knew each other, we'd all worked together, Mankiewicz and I grew up together, so it was like working with family. And I said, well, what am I going to do? I've signed pay or play, run of the play contract with Cyrano. And they said, well, there's an impending newspaper strike in New York, and let's see what happens. We were playing in Los Angeles, and we were about to go to San Francisco, waiting to see whether or not we were actually going to go to New York and open. For me, it was the greatest newspaper strike that ever happened. I am internally grateful, because the newspaper strike happened, lots of shows that had just opened were closing, and the producers of Cyrano decided not to go to Broadway, and I was able to do the pilot of Heart to Heart. And that was a wonderfully successful time in my life, and for which I'm eternally grateful. It was productive, it was extremely enjoyable, more so than so many things that could have happened to me. But I think that everybody who has a long-running show and tentacles that reach into personal life always says it was like a family. And indeed, in this instance, it also was, but ours was particularly dramatic because during the course of it, both Robert Wagner and I lost our partners, our life partners. So we bonded in a way, I suppose, that sort of was unusual, extremely unusual circumstances for people who were working together. Chemistry is just a question of the best of all possible luck. You can even see married people on stage or in films, and they might not have the chemistry that each one of them might have with somebody else. It's just the luck of the draw. I don't know how it happens. If I did, believe me, I would bottle it, and I would never have to worry again for the rest of my life. You know, the Heart to Heart was in many ways patterned after The Thin Man. Rapport without kitchen sink drama. We rose above all of the normal concerns of any couple, and it was all on a level of tremendous fantasy without ever having to deal or cope with the other side of married people's lives. I think that's why it was such an idyllic situation that I think everybody idolized the idea, that the concept that you wouldn't argue over who had to take out the garbage, because there was no garbage. Max could do it. And so I think that there were many, many aspects of the show that endeared us to people and touched the wonderful fantasies that we all have and hope to have, and these the things that dreams are made out of. I don't see much of that anymore. I don't know that whether reality is more interesting than fantasy. I don't know that the reality shows that we have are actually real. I think many of them are staged, and many of them are scripted. But I do think that, as far as I'm concerned, I'd rather not know too much about the dirty laundry of my neighbors and just think of them as nice people who live over there, you know, rather than have to see them regularly on an hour show. So I think that's what people who come up to me and say, oh, I wish Heart to Heart were back on the air. I think it's the essence of what Heart to Heart was that they lament doesn't exist anymore. And I hope somebody will create that same kind of a sense of happiness, joy, love for the sake of sheer adoration of one another, and without criticism or qualification. It would be nice. Well, entertainment has always, sort of bridged the gap between fantasy and reality as entertainment, as escapism. If it's just to turn on television to get white noise, which it is in some people's lives, that also serves a purpose, I suppose. And news as entertainment, I suppose, also serves a purpose. I'm afraid I'm a little bit old-fashioned. I like to see news for news. I want it reported by Walter Cronkite. I want it reported by people who actually know something about the news, not people who are trying to entertain me. I'd like to be entertained by people who are entertaining and who actually have a craft. And I like to enjoy that craft. I'm a great audience, but I'm not so much a great audience for bad acting on reality shows. After Heart to Heart was canceled abruptly, and quite surprising to us because we were preparing for another season. I was in France doing a television series called, a mini-series called Mistral's Daughter. And we were planning to come, Heart to Heart was planning to come to France to film 2 episodes. Really cute stories about, the Hart's going to see the fashion displays, the défilés and the fashion, the period of the fashion shows. And Freeway falls in love with a French poodle and gets lost and leads us on a great adventure. We had really cute story ideas. And one night, as I got the call from Tom Mankiewicz, Aaron Spelling, and Robert Wagner to do the pilot of Heart to Heart, I got a call from all of them to tell me in Paris that we were canceled. I think I cried all night. And then a couple of years later, RJ, which is Robert Wagner's nickname, called me and said, you know, there's a wonderful play, a 2-hander, called Love Letters that lots of people are doing, and I've had an offer for the both of us to go out and do the show. Would you be interested? I said, well, let me read it. And I'd worked a great deal in the theater, so it was never a huge leap for me. So it seemed like a wonderful idea. We did a trial run with it. Actually, I think we did a trial run with his mother and my mother and his kids and a lot of friends in his living room, and didn't feel too badly about it, and so off we went. We wound up doing over, oh my gosh, I think we set the record for a single pair doing a number of performances. We did over 400 performances of Love Letters, and opened the company in London. We played Hawaii. We did. We were in Canada. We had a wonderful go with it. And in the course of the tours that we would go on periodically, it was really the first time that we would meet, because we'd be all over the United States, and it was the first time that we would have an opportunity to meet the people who watched us, and who watched us for all those years. Even the young ones, even the little ones who watched us because their parents were watching us. And as they were now older, taller, and having relationships of their own, I found consistently young women coming up to me saying, I'm not going to settle for anything less than a relationship like Jonathan and Jennifer. And I said, oh God, it's a very high bar to set, but I hope you find it. And so if we were an influence for the good, how wonderful, how lovely, and how fortunate for us. For the most part, we had a little cluster of directors who would continually do our shows over the 5 years that we did them. But clearly, especially with the new writers that would come in the early stages of the development of the next season, clearly we knew those characters very well. And the scenes we used to call the heart-to-heart scenes, which were usually the ones in bed, much of that was improvised. not necessarily improvised so much as it was dialogue that we sometimes would improvise and sometimes improvise in the presence of the writers, so that we could show them, you know, what the rapport was, and nobody could really, after a while, nobody could really write those little exchanges. All they could do was put us in the circumstance where we could have our little exchanges. And because we'd created these characters, we did know them better than anybody else did. We were inside their skin. So in some cases, and certainly over a long period of time, the actors absolutely know their characters, in some cases, better than the writers. Because so many of the writers leave after the first year or so, sometimes because their brains are fried, others because they made the point of being on a successful show and they have other things they want to do. It's very difficult to keep good writers after a certain period of time. They all want to do something else, which is understandable. It's television, the pace of television, once you get used to it, is fabulous because you don't sit around. There's not a lot of downtime. I love working in the theater as an actor. I think it is the place where actors live. It's clearly the actor's medium. Obviously, you have to have something to say, so it has to be on the page before an actor can do anything. But between television and films, television under certain circumstances can be a much more spontaneous, much more immediate medium, provided you have done a great deal of homework on what you bring to the table. I think the development of a character is very much the responsibility of the actor in television. I think the development of a character in films, while it could in certain instances apply as well, I think the development of an actor in a film is much more the domain of the director and the writer, with certain input from actors, but very much it's their baby. Sometimes a character spills over, or at least there are elements of a character that spills over, especially if you are playing something which you're making some kind of a stretch in order to do. I had an occasion to do a mini-series about a woman who a true story, about a woman who coerced her son into the murder of her father. It was a rather famous case in New York City and in Utah, and 2 books were written about it, and in fact 2 miniseries were done. Lee Remick was in one and I was in the other. Frances was very much alive at the time and in prison. I had seen a documentary where she was interviewed, so indeed I changed the color of my hair, I wore padding, I smoked a cigarette the way she held it. There was certain body language that I studied and watched. And I saw myself in some happy snaps taken well after the filming of that miniseries was over. And Frances was still there. She was still, I had a very difficult time getting rid of Frances. She hung around for a long time. There are certain characters that do that to you. But I think it must have something to do with the personal stretch that you make in order to accommodate the character. I think it's important to put everything into the time context, because to say that life was so different then sounds like sort of an obvious remark, but it was such a different society. We probably also had about a third of the third less people on the face of the planet at the time, so the world was a very different place. and the context of our of pop culture or modern culture was also very different. While we take for granted that some of the freedoms of expression were in fact very well in place, they were in fact not in place. And I've been trying to dig out exactly, through some of the research that we're doing for a book that I'm writing, exactly the date of this particular event that I'm going to tell you about. And I think that it was sometime around the 1970 mark. There was a group of representatives of the motion picture and television industry that was invited to testify in Washington in front of the, is it SCC or? FCC, right, in the Federal Communications Commission. At the time of the expiration of the sort of, I suppose, monopoly, or let's say exclusivity of CBS, ABC, and NBC, the three networks. And the issue was to open the doors for what was then called family choice television. This was the preamble to cable television. I, to this day, don't know why I was chosen to go with this august body of people, but I'm thrilled that I did, and it was an extraordinary experience, and I'm eternally grateful that I actually participated in this event. Sidney Boettcher was there, representing, I'm sure, blacks and minorities in films. Edward Anhalt was the head of the Writers Guild. He was there representing writers. Robert Wise was the head of the Directors Guild. Walter Mirisch was the head of the Producers Guild, and me. I guess I represented women in films and television, I suppose, and I'm very flattered that they chose me. Louis Nizer was a great, well-known attorney from New York. He was the consulting counsel, and Jack Valenti was the head of the motion picture and television lobby in Washington. We met in Washington. The following day we testified in front of the 8 people which constituted the FCC at the time, giving our brief, which was to open the potential and the possibilities for something which we now know of as cable television, satellite TV, all of this freedom of choice that we have. The next day, the networks testified, and the following day, the decision was made. And the rest is history. The day was won by our little group of people. The floodgates opened. They came with a trickle at first, and now they are a full-blown coursing of cascade of water in what we now know as all of this choice that we have. I don't think that the idea was that it would be quite as copycat as it's become. The hope was that it could express the greatest spectrum of individual expression, but a broad spectrum of individual expression, representational of all of the tastes of the spectators and the viewers who would subscribe to those individualese and rather specifically individualized programming. That's not quite happened. Much of it's been tried to be competitive with sort of commercial television, but there's still some very narrow spectrums which are still catered to, and hopefully will prosper as those niche markets open up. So that also puts it in the context, puts all of this retrospection on television in the context of what the times were like and how different they were now that we take for granted that all of these wonderful hundreds of programs are available to us. We can't really remember how specific television really was, and not in the not too distant past.